In the heart of the American Midwest, Wichita, Kansas, stands as a symbol of industriousness and community. It is an aviation hub, a place where the planes stretch out toward the horizon and where neighborhoods were designed with the promise of safety and suburban tranquility. However, for 3 decades, a shadow hung over this city, a darkness that fundamentally altered the way its citizens lived their lives. From 1974 until 2005, a phantom haunted the streets of Wichita. He was an entity who thrived on fear, a criminal who demanded attention, and a man who hid in plain sight behind a mask of aggressive normalcy. This is the story of the investigation into the self-styled BTK Killer, a case that frustrated law enforcement for a generation, only to be solved by the very technology the perpetrator tried to manipulate. To understand the magnitude of this case, one must look back to the morning of January 15, 1974. The Otero family, Joseph, Julie, and their 2 youngest children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, were preparing for a standard day. Joseph was a retired Air Force mechanic who had found work in the aviation industry, a job that brought the family to Wichita. They were settling into their new life in a quiet neighborhood. But when the 3 older Otero children returned home from school that afternoon, they walked into a scene that shattered their reality. Inside the home, the silence was heavy. They discovered their parents and siblings had been bound and had sustained fatal injuries. The phone lines to the house had been cut, a calculated move that suggested this was not a crime of passion, but one of premeditation. The police arrived to find a scene that defied immediate explanation. There was no sign of forced entry that would suggest a chaotic break-in. Items of value were left behind, ruling out a simple burglary gone wrong. The method of the crime, systematic restraint and asphyxiation, indicated a perpetrator who was organized, controlled, and driven by a psychological need for dominance rather than financial gain. The community of Wichita, unaccustomed to such severe violence, was plunged into a state of immediate anxiety. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted. The police, led by determined detectives, canvassed the neighborhood, but the leads were scarce. It was a crime that seemed to have occurred in a vacuum. Months passed without a suspect. The investigation began to cool, as is often the tragic case with random acts of violence. But the perpetrator was not content with silence. In October of 1974, a letter was discovered inside an engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library. The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero murders, providing details that only the killer and the police could know. The tone of the letter was arrogant, demanding, and disturbing. The author suggested that a monster controlled his brain, a poor attempt to plead insanity before he was even caught. It was in this correspondence that he suggested potential names for himself, including the acronym that would eventually become his moniker, BTK. Bind, torture, kill. This communication changed the landscape of the investigation. It shifted the profile from a transient drifter to someone who craved recognition. He wanted the city to know he was there. He wanted the police to fear him. And tragically, he was not finished. In April 1974, before the letter was even found, he struck again. Catherine Bright, a young woman with a promising future, was attacked in her home. She fought back valiantly, but ultimately succumbed to her injuries. Her brother, who was also present, survived the attack despite sustaining a gunshot wound. His survival provided the police with their first physical description of the attacker. A man of average build, wearing a mustache. It was a generic description that could have fit thousands of men in Kansas, but it was a start. The years that followed saw the terror escalate. In March 1977, Shirley Vian was found deceased in her home. Later that same year, in December, Nancy Fox became the next victim. The modus operandi remained consistent: cutting phone lines, stalking victims, and the use of ligatures. With each crime, the killer's confidence seemed to grow. He began calling the police to report his own crimes. His voice calm and detached, directing officers to the scenes of his atrocities. He sent poems and letters to local media outlets, taunting the authorities for their inability to catch him. He thrived on the cat-and-mouse game, treating the investigation as a contest of wits. By the late 1970s, the Wichita Police Department had formed a special task force known as the Ghostbusters. They utilized the best technology available at the time. They analyzed the letters for linguistic patterns, checked thousands of fingerprints, and followed up on endless tips. Yet, the killer remained elusive. He was a ghost who could vanish into the fabric of the city. Then, the pattern shifted. After the late 1970s, the frequency of the crimes appeared to drop. The city held its breath. Had he moved? Had he been incarcerated for another crime? Had he died? For years, there was silence. But unbeknownst to the public, the killer was still active, though his intervals had lengthened. In 1985, Maureen Hedge, a neighbor of the killer, was taken from her home. In 1986, Vicky Waygirl was killed. In 1991, Dolores Davis became the final victim. In these later cases, the killer displayed a chilling patience, often waiting years between attacks. He would later describe these periods as cooling-off times, during which he lived a seemingly normal life. This duality is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the case. The man behind the acronym was Dennis Rader. To the outside world, Rader was the picture of suburban respectability. He was a Cub Scout leader. He was an active member of his church, eventually rising to become the president of the church council. He was a father of two and a husband. He worked as a compliance officer for Park City, a suburb of Wichita, a job that gave him a badge, a uniform, and the authority to harass neighbors over the length of their grass or the placement of their fences. It was a role that fed his need for control and dominance in a socially acceptable way. He was known as a stickler for rules, an overzealous bureaucrat who was annoying but seemingly harmless. No one suspected that the man measuring their lawn height was the same man responsible for the city's worst nightmares. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the BTK case had become a cold case legend. The files were vast, but the fresh leads were non-existent. The killer had not communicated with the media in decades. Many assumed the mystery would never be solved. The turning point came in 2004. On the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, the Wichita Eagle newspaper ran a retrospective piece on the crimes. The article implied that BTK was a relic of the past, a forgotten criminal whose legacy was fading. It suggested that people had moved on. For a narcissist like Dennis Rader, this was an intolerable insult. He could not bear the thought of being irrelevant. He needed to remind the world that he was still the one in control. In March 2004, the silence was broken. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to Vicky Waygirl, the victim from 1986, whose murder had not been definitively linked to BTK by the public. Along with the license were photos of the crime scene that only the killer could have taken. The message was clear: I am still here. This sparked the largest police mobilization in Kansas history. The task force was reactivated, led by Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, a seasoned investigator who had worked the case for years. This time, however, the police had a new strategy. They knew they were dealing with a narcissist who craved attention. They decided to use the media to communicate directly with him, feeding his ego to draw him out. They held press conferences, acknowledging his return, asking for clarity, and treating him as a partner in a dialogue. It was a psychological trap designed to make him feel safe enough to make a mistake. Rader took the bait. Over the next year, he sent a series of packages. These packages contained puzzles, word searches, bizarre autobiographical sketches, and dolls bound to resemble his victims. He left these packages in public places: a library book drop, a cereal box left on a roadside, a box in the back of a pickup truck. With each drop, he felt a surge of power, believing he was outsmarting the entire police force. However, the world had changed since 1974. Forensic science and digital technology had advanced in ways Rader did not fully comprehend. He was a man of the analog age trying to operate in a digital world. In one of his communications, he asked the police a specific question. "Can I communicate with a floppy disk?" Be honest. The police, seeing a golden opportunity, responded through the media. They placed a classified ad as per his instructions, confirming that yes, a floppy disk would be safe and could not be traced. It was a ruse, a calculated lie in the pursuit of justice. Rader, trusting the police's honesty and believing he had established a rapport with them, sent a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to a local television station in February 2005. He believed he had wiped the disk clean of any personal data. He was wrong. The disk was immediately handed over to computer forensics experts. While the document on the disk appeared to be just a message from the killer, digital files contain metadata, hidden information about the file's history. The experts analyzed the deleted data on the disk. They found a Microsoft Word document that had been recovered. The metadata revealed that the document had been last modified by a user named Dennis. Furthermore, the document had a link to a specific location, Christ Lutheran Church. The investigators were stunned. Dennis, at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of the congregation at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. The pieces began to fall into place rapidly. Investigators looked at Dennis Rader. He lived in Park City. He had access to a vehicle. His job as a compliance officer allowed him to roam neighborhoods without suspicion. But they needed definitive proof. They could not risk arresting the wrong man and letting the real killer go underground. They discovered that Rader's daughter had had a pap smear at the Kansas State University Medical Clinic years prior. In a sealed warrant, police obtained the DNA sample from the medical archives. They compared the familial DNA from the daughter's sample to the DNA evidence preserved from the crime scenes decades earlier. The results were a match. The DNA profile confirmed that Dennis Rader was the source of the genetic material found at the BTK crime scenes. The ghost had a name. On February 25, 2005, a task force of local police and FBI agents moved in. Dennis Rader was driving near his home when he was pulled over. He was surrounded. Officers approached the vehicle, weapons drawn but steady. Rader, ever the bureaucrat, simply asked, "What is this about?" He was taken to the interrogation room. Initially, he played coy, denying involvement. But the investigators, led by Lieutenant Landwehr, laid their cards on the table. They told him about the DNA. They told him about the metadata on the floppy disk. When Rader realized the game was truly over, his reaction was not one of remorse or anger, but of professional curiosity. He asked, "How did you catch me?" When told about the floppy disk, he appeared genuinely hurt. "I thought we had a deal," he said, referring to the police's lie about the disk being untraceable. He felt betrayed, a surreal sentiment coming from a man who had betrayed the sanctity of life 10 times over. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. For over 30 hours, Dennis Rader detailed his crimes. He did not speak with the frantic energy of a madman, but with the dry, monotone delivery of a man giving a quarterly report. He described the stalking, the preparation, and the acts themselves with a clinical detachment that disturbed even the most hardened detectives. He referred to his victims as projects. He discussed his hit kit, a briefcase containing his ropes and weapons, as if it were a toolbox for a home improvement job. He explained how he selected his victims, often by pure chance or convenience. He described how he would watch them, learn their routines, and wait for the perfect moment. He admitted to the murders of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerl, and Dolores Davis. He provided details that closed the book on every single open question the families had harbored for decades. The news of Rader's arrest sent shockwaves through Wichita and the nation. His family was devastated. His wife of over 30 years had no idea she was sleeping next to a monster. His children, now grown adults, had to reconcile their memories of a normal father with the reality of his double life. The members of Christ Lutheran Church were left reeling, struggling to understand how the man who led their prayers was capable of such darkness. The legal process was swift. Rader waived his right to a preliminary hearing. On June 27, 2005, he stood before the court to enter his plea. In a surreal display, he pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. But he didn't just say, "guilty." At the judge's request for a factual basis for the plea, Rader launched into a monologue. He described the murders in graphic, calm detail, correcting the judge on minor points of fact, appearing almost proud of his work. He treated the courtroom like a lecture hall, devoid of any empathy for the weeping families in the gallery. The sentencing hearing in August 2005 was the moment the community finally reclaimed its power. Kansas did not have the death penalty in effect at the time the crimes were committed, so Rader faced life imprisonment. But before the sentence was handed down, the families of the victims were given the chance to speak. They stood up, one by one. They spoke not of Rader's power, but of his weakness. They spoke of the love they still held for their lost family members. They stripped away the BTK mystique and revealed him for what he was. A small, pathetic man who preyed on the vulnerable to make himself feel big. They refused to let his darkness extinguish their light. The judge sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years without the possibility of parole. It was the maximum penalty allowed by law. Rader was transported to the El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, designated to a special management unit. The capture of the BTK Killer stands as a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the evolution of forensic science. It highlights the critical role of cold case units and the importance of never closing a file until justice is served. But it also serves as a study in the psychology of the psychopath. Rader's downfall was his own arrogance, his need to be recognized, his compulsion to taunt the police, and his inability to let the past go were the very things that led him to a cage. He believed he was a criminal mastermind, superior to the detectives chasing him. In the end, he was undone by his own vanity and a lack of understanding of a simple floppy disk. The technology he thought would carry his message of terror instead carried the digital fingerprint that bound him to his crimes. The legacy of this case is not the name BTK, which Rader so desperate coveted. The legacy belongs to the Oteros, to Catherine Bright, to Shirley Vian, to Nancy Fox, to Maureen Hedge, to Vicky Waygirl, and to Dolores Davis. It belongs to the investigators who never gave up, and to the families who endured 30 years of uncertainty with unwavering resilience. Today, Wichita is no longer defined by the shadow of the unknown killer. The fear has subsided, replaced by the knowledge that justice, though delayed, is absolute. As we reflect on this case, we are left with a lingering question about the nature of safety and the masks people wear. Dennis Rader lived among his neighbors for decades. A wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding behind the veneer of a uniform and a church title. It forces us to ask, how well do we truly know the people around us? And in an age where we share so much of our lives digitally, are we becoming more safe? Or are we simply providing new avenues for the darkness to reach us? Justice was served in Kansas, but the vigilance of a community remains its strongest defense.